One of the most common mistakes we see in communication is the overuse of technology or blaming others. Let's take the real life example that anybody that has worked in one of our offices will have dealt with. Let's take the resident who's paying their rent late. They come in and they don't want to pay the late fee. So they're going to argue about it. Can't you waive it this time? Well, you're going to tell them no because they've been late 3 other times. But let's be real here. If they had the $1,500 to pay your rent in the first place, they would. But by now, you've added on a $100 late fee, and depending on whether or not they're paying after the 11th, you've added in $150 or $200 in court fees. That's a lot of money for someone that is living paycheck to paycheck. So when we communicate with that individual, we want to do so with empathy. But let's talk about what we don't want to do. Here's a real life example. Mrs. Jones comes in and Mrs. Jones says, I need for you to waive this late fee because my kid was sick. I couldn't go to work the last 3 days, and now my paycheck's not as big, so I need for you to waive it, please. Well, when you tell Mrs. Jones no, if you go about it in this manner, how do you think Mrs. Jones is going to react? Mrs. Jones, you know you have to pay the late fee. The lease says so. Did you read your lease, Mrs. Jones? Because you know you've been late enough times that you know you have to pay the late fee. My boss is up at the corporate office. They don't let us waive them, so you have to pay it. How would you feel if you were Mrs. Jones? Likely not very good. Not only would you feel like somebody had just chastised you, but here the manager or the business manager or leasing person has just told you that they have no power, they have no authority, and it's the other people's fault. That's not good or effective communication. The better answer would be to do this. Mrs. Jones, I am so sorry to hear that your child has been sick. I understand how frustrating it must be for you to know that you have to pay these fees, and I understand it makes it very tough. Unfortunately, while I would love to help you, we're unable to waive the late fees because it's not the first time you've been late. You might remember we did waive it that first time, but I can't do it now. So how can we resolve this? And how much more time would you need to pay the late fee and the court fees if you can pay the rest of your rent today? Would you feel differently than the first scenario? Probably if you were Mrs. Jones, because you've just told Mrs. Jones, you've said, I'm empathetic to your situation. You've addressed the fact that Mrs. Jones had sick children, and you've commented on that. Why? Because you were listening to hear what Mrs. Jones said. You weren't listening to respond. How you handle those critical situations is going to determine the response from Mrs. Jones. Okay, we've talked about some great tips today about communication and how you can communicate more effectively in your personal life and in your professional life. Let's put it all together. I've got some best practices and some Melanie tips that I think you're going to want to hear. So let's start talking about those. First, when someone walks in your office, our expectation at RR Living is that you stand and you greet that customer. You stand up, you greet them with a smile, and you say hello right off. If you're on the phone when they walk in or you're with someone else, you still are going to look at them, make eye contact. If you're on the phone, say just a moment, and then make eye contact with the person walking in and say, have a seat, I'll be with you in just a minute. That small gesture can make all the difference in the world in how someone feels. Have you ever walked in an office or you walked into a business and you see all the people walking around, but apparently you're invisible? Nobody sees you. Nobody speaks. What an uncomfortable feeling. We don't want discomfort. We want our customers to know that they matter. The second tip in best practice is to ask them what you can help them with. Always ask, don't assume, because by asking, you're giving them the opportunity to share, and then you're going to be listening so that you hear what they're saying, and then you'll respond. So the third best practice is to ask open-ended questions. What is an open-ended question? An open-ended question is a question that someone cannot answer with a yes or a no. Okay? Yes or no questions are called close-ended questions. They're called closed because they will close out the conversation, and they're essentially telling someone subliminally, I'm done. Okay? You don't want that. So you're going to ask open-ended questions. Let's say an example. An open-ended is, hi, Mrs. Jones, what may I help you with today? Or, hi, Mrs. Jones, what brings you to the office today? It's great to see you. That question is much better because Mrs. Jones has to think about an answer, and then she has to tell you the reason she's there. A close-ended would be, hi, Mrs. Jones, are you here to pay your rent? Or, hi, Mrs. Jones, are you here with another service request? That is a yes or no question. Those questions, when they're yes and no or close-ended, will oftentimes put someone on the defensive without your ever intending to do so. Ask open-ended. A fourth best practice is to always ask somebody to sit. And then, number 5 is to acknowledge what they're saying. Acknowledge it verbally. There are several reasons why we want to ask somebody to sit, especially if somebody comes in and they're upset. Why would we want to do that? Well, the first thing is when somebody comes in and they're upset, your goal in that moment is to diffuse the anger and to diffuse that emotion that you're picking up from their body language and from what they're saying. So by asking somebody to sit, the benefit is it gives that person something to do. They have to stop and hear what you're saying, which means they take a breath in their argument or their displeasure. Or if it's a new prospect that comes in, you're asking them to sit, which A, means subliminally, I want you to stay and I want you to be comfortable. That's what you want to do. So that's the reason for those two. When you can get someone to sit down and listen to you, you're 50% to the answer you want, whether that is having them say yes to the lease or whether it is calming them down so you can understand and solve the problem they came to you with. This works whether it's a team member or whether it's a resident or a vendor. Now, let's also say, okay, why else would we want them to sit? Well, great question. And the reason is, if you are talking to someone and they're standing up, then subliminally they're above you in their mind. And it means that they're projecting their voice talking down. That is not what you want. You want to, as quickly as possible, get that other party on the same level as you are so that the two of you are having a communication that is built on equal respect and it's built on togetherness and understanding and resolving an issue or understanding what their need is so that you can find that perfect apartment home. So we already know, acknowledge and greet, smile, ask questions and what you can help them with. Ask them to sit down because once they're sitting and comfortable, they're less likely to leave. How many times have you had somebody walk in and say, I just want to get pricing? Oh, I'm looking for an apartment, but no, I just want to get pricing. What happens if you just give them the price? Easy question, they walk out the door. Do you have their contact information? Do you know what they need? Do you know that they have a pet? What did you just find out? Did you give that person any reason to want to lease with you? No. Remember, communication is also about relationship. So when someone comes in, ask them to sit, ask them to tell you what it is they're in there for, and then listen to them so you can solve and handle their need. The next tool is to always choose your words carefully and to choose your tone carefully. We've talked a little bit in our prior sessions about how voice inflection and about how your nonverbal cues impact how someone hears your messaging. There are a lot of ways that we can react when somebody comes into our office unhappy. Some of you may have heard this story, but when I was a community manager in Long Beach, Mississippi, sitting at my desk one day, a man walks in, he has a black trash bag. Okay, this is a true story. I stand up and greet because that is the right thing to do. And I ask him, "Hi, I'm Melanie. I'm the manager. How can I help you?" This gentleman asks me if I'm really the manager. I say yes. He takes his black bag and he dumps it on my desk. It was all these fish heads and fish guts. True story. I had two choices then. I had to make a decision in a split second. I could either ask, "What the heck?" or "Why did you do that?" or I could tell him to get out of the office. That's not what I did, because had I done that, it would have made that situation worse. Because A, I knew that if that man walked in, dumped out all of that on my desk, he was upset already. So if he's upset, I need to diffuse the situation. So what did I do? I said, "Well, thank you." He proceeded to tell me that one of our residents had dumped those fish heads over his fence and into his yard, so he was returning them. At that point, what can I say? Okay, there is nothing I can say that's going to make it better. So I simply said, "Well, thank you, and we'll try to make sure that doesn't happen again." He left. I never saw him again. But had I reacted negatively, it could have turned into a much worse situation, and one where it could have really been bad, because sometimes residents don't come in with the best of intent. So think before you respond. Understand your audience, understand those outside influences, and let's not let residents put fish heads over the fence. Now, let's get into some really important tips for you. We're up to number 7 and 8. So on this tip, one of the things that I'm going to suggest to you is to always ask your open-ended questions. That we talked about, the open and the closed, right? You already know that. But do you know that you should be open-minded as well? That means be willing to hear the bad with the good. Be open-minded enough to know that what you think is correct may be wrong. How do I know that? I've lived it. So think about it in this term, a real life experience. I was the manager, have a resident come in, the resident's unhappy, they're telling us that my service team has repaired their leaks, but they left the hole open in the ceiling, and not only that, they used this resident's towels to dry up the rotten sewer and to dry up the leak, okay? Being the manager I am, I pick up the walkie-talkie and I actually communicate or pick up and call my service person on the cell phone and say, "Hi, did you fix Mrs. Jones' ceiling?" Service person says, "Yes, I already fixed it. It's done. Everything's working." I'm going to say, "Are you sure?" Now, I know that Mrs. Jones is sitting there in front of me. The service person says, "Yes, Melanie, it's fixed." Okay? Well, I take that at the word. So then Mrs. Jones goes home. She takes pictures to show me that what I was just told was wrong. So be open-minded and never assume, because when you start assuming, you will make mistakes. Instead, your better option is, I understood from Horatio that he had already taken care of that, but since you're telling me that's not true, let me go with you and look at it, because I really want to make sure that whatever we did, if it wasn't right, we quickly resolve it. And I'm really sorry that you're having to deal with this. Number 8, when someone comes in and they're angry, lower your voice. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. If somebody is yelling at you, then the quieter you bring your voice down, do you know what happens? They have to lower theirs so that they can hear you. This is such an easy answer to diffuse a situation, yet it's one that a lot of people don't know about. So the next time you have somebody that's unhappy, try lowering your voice after you've asked them to sit. And I guarantee you that they will start getting quieter because they have to be quiet and slow down in order to hear what you're saying. Human nature.